Lance Armstrong, Neil Armstrong, was not only a trailblazing lunar pioneer, but a fascinating individual too. The movie First Man sheds light on some of the key events surrounding America's first successful mission to the moon, but how many are factually true? Or at least not embellished by Hollywood? Why did Apollo 1 ignite? On the 27th of January 1967, 3 astronauts indeed lost their lives during a launch pad plugs out test. This test is where the spacecraft has no fuel and a disabled pyrotechnic system. Merely a systems procedure test. The cabin was pressurized with oxygen. Oxygen itself is not flammable, but it is a high energy gas that very readily oxidizes other materials. Some materials that are not combustible or are only very slightly combustible under normal conditions, and therefore not a danger, can become very combustible and hazardous when oxygen levels are high. The large amounts of flammable material, such as Velcro, in the cabin's oxygen-rich environment allowed the fire to start and spread quickly once the electrical arcs occurred from the interior equipment's wiring. Later missions removed much of the flammable material, as well as introducing self-extinguishing components. Was the lunar module seconds from running out of fuel? During the landing of the lunar module, an alarm went off with a 1202 error code from the module's computer. This translated to, "I have too much to do. I'm going to stop, reboot, and start again." Flight controller at NASA, Steve Bales, made the call to continue the mission. It is just as dangerous to abort a mission with a bad computer as it would be to carry on the mission. After Steve assessed the risk factors, he decided that carrying on the mission was the safest option. Minutes later, the computer spit out another alarm code, 1201, but this was in the same class as the previous alarm, so they just continued. It was soon realized that the lunar module was coming in long or downrange of the predicted landing zone. The Eagle was indeed heading towards a large crater and truck-sized boulders. Armstrong leveled off and searched for a new smooth landing location. The Eagle was still hundreds of feet above the moon's surface when they barely had 60 seconds of fuel left. So Neil and Buzz finally touched down on the moon's surface, with only seconds of fuel left in the tank. What happened to the other Apollo missions? So how did we get from Apollo 1 to Apollo 11 so quickly? Well, it's all a little bit messy, but we'll step through it. The first shuttle off the rank is AS-201. We'll call this Apollo 1A for now. You'll see why. Then we have AS-202, then AS-203, then AS-204. Now AS-204 was where the 3 astronauts perished in the plugs out test and from a fire inside the capsule. So because this happened, Apollo AS-201 was later referred to as Apollo 1 now, and from then on they moved to Apollo 4 from there on. So those first 4 missions caught 1, 2, 3, and then the mission with the fire from the plugs out test. So we're now calling this Apollo 1. So we then moved to Apollo 4, Apollo 5, Apollo 6, Apollo 7, Apollo 8, Apollo 9, and Apollo 10. Now all these missions tested orbiting, docking procedures, command service modules. Apollo 10 even went all the way to the moon, orbited around it and came back again, which was the dress rehearsal for what became Apollo 11, which was of course the rocket that made it to the surface of the moon. Well, which took man to the moon, let's be more precise. Why did they lose control of the Gemini 8 lunar module? Soon after Neil Armstrong and David Scott successfully docked the Gemini 8 module to the orbiting Agena target vehicle, Scott started to notice that they were rolling soon after the docking. Armstrong used Gemini's OASM thrusters to stop the roll, but after it stopped, it immediately started again. Afraid of possible damage to either the Gemini or the propellant-heavy Agena, the crew undocked from the Agena and thrusted away. Now, with less mass, the Gemini started to spin rapidly and at one point up to 1 full rotation per second. The problem was a fault with a OAMS thruster which was stuck on. Neil Armstrong shut down the OAMS system and used the re-entry control system thrusters instead to counteract the dangerous spiral. Having burnt most of their re-entry fuel to stop the tumble, the crew made an emergency landing in the Pacific Ocean.
The DoD manager immediately punches the button, which puts him in contact with Pacific Recovery Control, Hawaii. Hawaii alerts the captain of the Mason. He swings around and heads for 7-3.
The US Air Force was dispatched to the new landing zone, where they successfully located the capsule and attached flotation collars to keep it afloat. Did Neil Armstrong actually throw his daughter's bracelet into that crater? We're going to have to slowly build a case around this idea. The film starts on a very dour note, as Neil and his wife Janet finds out that their young daughter Karen has terminal cancer, and unfortunately passes away not too long afterwards. During what was meticulously planned lunar walk, Armstrong did indeed wander off by himself to a little west crater for an unplanned moment alone. The credible speculation comes from James Hansen, who had 55 hours of taped recorded personal interviews and hundreds of emails. During interviewing Neil for his biography, Hansen first speculated in the book that Armstrong may have left a memento of his deceased daughter, Karen, behind.
Will you take anything?
If I had a choice, I'd take more fuel.
In an article on space.com, James described Neil as someone of mild and modest personality. He would actively try and avoid the public attention as an attempt to deflect any undeserved individual profit from the collaborative team effort. Neil revealed a story to James about how he was flying a Panther jet over North Korea in 1951. When he saw rows and rows of North Korean soldiers, unarmed, doing their daily calisthenics outside their field barracks, Neil refused to fire upon them, as stating, "It looks like they were having a rough enough time doing their morning exercises." When James interviewed his squadron later, none of them had heard of the story, but all accepted the story's credibility without hesitation. Such was the magnanimous and self-effacing nature of the man. James goes on to write, "Neil was quite adamant that he didn't want the story in his biography, and I tell you now, after his death, with some reluctance." The screenwriter of First Man, Josh Singer, only included the bracelet scene because James Hansen mentioned that he thought that this happened. I think he left something of Karen's on the moon. Since James Hansen helped write the screenplay with Josh Singer, it would go against the grain in what is otherwise a very historically accurate movie to include such a trite Hollywood metaphor. If James Hansen, who knew many secretive facts about Neil, encouraged the screenwriter to include the scene in the movie, then there's good reason to believe the veracity with a fair degree of confidence. Perhaps James was leaking one last secret of the late Neil Armstrong, to illuminate the humanity of the man, a man whose hard work and kindness was only ever eclipsed by his modesty.